with the many times we've heard of piracy from movies and stories, featuring men who operated outside the law on the open sea and answered to nobody. But government-approved piracy is different. Men were given official documents by their queens and their trading companies, authorizing them to attack, raid, and strip the wealth from ships flying the flag of an enemy nation. They would keep a significant cut for themselves as ransom. This was called privateering, and in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, it was one of the most consequential financial and military strategies in European history. It made individuals extraordinarily rich. It funded wars, which in turn weakened one empire while building two others. When it was finally shut down, the men who had spent years doing it legally simply kept doing it illegally and helped create the Golden Age of Piracy. This usually started with silver, and at that, almost incomprehensible amounts of it. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas in 1492, the Spanish Empire that sent him immediately understood what it had found wasn't just a new world, but a source of wealth that could fund Spanish dominance over Europe indefinitely. The early ships heading back from the Americas carried whatever the settlers and local peoples could find, but by the 1540s, the Spanish had discovered massive silver deposits at ancient Potosi, which is now called Bolivia, at Zacatecas in Mexico. Deposits were so extensive that they would eventually produce roughly 80% of the world's silver supply over the following century. Getting that silver back to Spain required infrastructure on a scale that had never been attempted before, so new mining techniques were developed to extract silver faster. More ships were built to transport it. And as the volume of silver crossing the Atlantic grew, so did the attention of everyone who wanted a piece of it. Pirates and rival European powers began circling the treasure routes almost immediately, which forced Spain into building convoy systems. In other words, groups of armed galleons traveling together just to protect the silver-laden ships headed home. Spain developed two major silver routes. The first ran across the Atlantic, from ports like Veracruz, Havana, and Portobelo in the Americas, to the Spanish port of Seville. The second, established in 1571, ran from Acapulco in Mexico all the way to Manila in the Philippines. On this route, the silver was traded for Chinese silk and porcelain, mainly because China needed silver for its currency system and didn't mind paying for it. The Spanish peso, also known as the piece of 8, became so widely used and so consistently reliable in quality that it effectively became the world's first truly global currency. However, that was enough to make them a target. The religious wars that tore through Europe after the Protestant Reformation gave Spain's enemies not just motivation, but moral justification for what they were about to do. The Spanish Habsburgs were the most powerful defenders of the Roman Catholic Church in Europe, using the wealth from their American colonies to fund their armies and their religious campaigns. When Dutch Calvinists revolted against Spanish rule in 1568, Spain found itself in a grinding conflict that would eventually last 80 years. Spain also intervened in France's religious wars and made moves against England, partly because of its break from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, and partly because of its support for Spain's enemies. From the perspective of England and the Dutch rebels, the silver fleets were the strategic center of gravity. If you hit the money, you hit everything that depended on it. The problem was that a direct naval confrontation with Spain wasn't a realistic option, since the Spanish Navy was one of the strongest in Europe, and neither England nor the Dutch rebels had the resources to meet it head-on in open battle. So they found another way. Queen Elizabeth I of England began issuing documents called letters of marque to merchant ship captains. These letters were legal authorizations or official government documents that gave private individuals permission to attack ships belonging to an enemy nation. The men who carried them were not pirates under the law. They were privateers, operating as private enterprises but under crown authority. They could raid Spanish ships while keeping a portion of whatever they captured. The arrangement worked for everyone involved. The Queen got revenue and damage inflicted on her enemy without directly committing English naval forces, allowing captains to get rich. Overall, Spain got hit repeatedly from directions it couldn't always anticipate or prevent. The Dutch had their own unique version. Rather than individual captains operating under royal letters of marque, the Dutch rebels depended on a fleet called the Watergeuzen. This name dates back to people called sea beggars. Also, these ships were the predecessors of what would eventually become the Dutch Navy. The Watergeuzen were seizing ports, creating bases of operations and systematically dismantling Spanish control of the Dutch coastline from the water. The earliest admirals learned their craft aboard these ships. But as the war went on, the scale of the operation grew dramatically. It would be foolish to leave out the English sea dogs, because if privateering had a cast of characters, England's were among the most famous. Sir Francis Drake is probably the name most people recognize, maybe because the record attached to his name is genuinely extraordinary. From 1577 to 1580, Drake became the second captain in history to circumnavigate the globe, and he didn't do it for the academic achievement. He spent the voyage attacking Spanish shipping and Spanish colonies in the Americas from his flagship. By the time he returned to England, the cargo he had taken was worth more than double England's entire annual revenue, not a portion of it, more than double the whole thing. Queen Elizabeth's share alone cleared the crown's entire foreign debt and left enough over to invest in the Levant Company. They would later rebrand into the East India Company, which is one of the most powerful commercial organizations in history. But Drake wasn't done. In 1587, a year before the famous Armada, he led a raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz, with English warships and privateers sailing directly into the harbor and destroying a significant portion of the Spanish fleet while it sat at anchor. He called it singeing the King of Spain's beard. What it actually did was delay the launch of the Spanish Armada by a full year, thereby giving England crucial time to prepare its defenses. When the Armada did come in 1588, Drake served as second in command of the English fleet that defeated it and strengthened his reputation. Sir Walter Raleigh operated differently, less in terms of single dramatic raids and more in terms of sustained systematic pressure on Spanish convoy routes from the West Indies. He hunted Spanish and Portuguese ships carrying silver and other colonial wealth, so effective at it that his name became comparable to Drake. Sir John Hawkins contributed something that outlasted any single raid. He helped design a faster, more efficient hull for English warships, giving them the ability to outrun and outsail their Spanish counterparts. The tactical and design innovations that Drake, Raleigh, Hawkins, and the other sea dogs developed are still studied by the Royal Navy today. On the Dutch side, the name that stands out above all others is Admiral Piet Hein, and his most famous exploit sounds too audacious to be true yet is completely documented. In 1628, Hein took a fleet of Dutch warships and privateers and intercepted the entire Spanish silver fleet in Matanzas Bay in Cuba. He didn't just raid a ship or two, he captured the entire convoy including the silver it was carrying, estimated at somewhere between 11 and 12 million guilders. The Dutch West India Company used the proceeds to fund a full year of war against Spain and still had money left over. Hein became a national hero in the Netherlands, celebrated in songs and stories that persisted for generations. He later died the following year in a naval engagement, which only added to the legend. Other Dutch captains like Willem de la Marque II were less celebrated historically, but no less aggressive in their methods. De la Marque and the Watergeuzen operated with a ferocity that alarmed even their own government at times. But their effectiveness in seizing and holding ports along the Dutch coast was a significant factor in keeping the revolt alive during its vulnerable years. The cooperation between English and Dutch privateers deserves its own moment because it represents effective strategic collaboration between two separate nations against a common enemy. From 1585 to 1604, the Treaty of Nonsuch formalized English support for the Dutch rebels, and English and Dutch ships began operating together against Spanish convoys. Behind this collaboration was a man named Sir Francis Walsingham. He was Elizabeth's spy master and one of the more underappreciated figures of the era. Walsingham built a network of intelligence agents across Europe specifically to track Spanish naval movements. His people reported on when ships left harbor, when convoys were expected to arrive from the colonies, and where Spanish forces were concentrated. English and Dutch captains received this information, eventually using it to hit Spanish shipping with a precision that would have been impossible without the intelligence infrastructure behind it. The most famous joint operation was the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. England mobilized everything it had into a single fleet. The Dutch used a mixed force of warship and privateers to prevent the Duke of Alba's army from sailing to England from the Netherlands, effectively blocking the land component of Spain's plan. The coordination worked, but the Armada failed. 8 years later, when the Earl of Essex led an Anglo-Dutch fleet to sack Cadiz in 1596, the collaboration produced one of the most successful amphibious raids of the century. The English signed a peace treaty with Spain in 1604, which temporarily ended the formal partnership. However, the alliance resumed in 1625, where Dutch and English ships continued to operate together against Spanish interests. The end of the privateering era is when the English signed the Treaty of London in 1604. King James I agreed to stop issuing letters of marque and end attacks on Spanish shipping. The captains who had spent years raiding Spanish ships for profit were not particularly interested in stopping. Instead, they built their identities around the enterprise. Stopping just because a peace treaty said so wasn't an easy transition. Many of them didn't make it. Captains like Jack Ward and Peter Easton simply kept doing what they had always done, like attacking ships on the open sea. Except now, without the legal authorization that had made them privateers rather than pirates. They crossed that line without much apparent hesitation, and in doing so, they became part of the growing crisis of Atlantic piracy that would define the 18th century. This golden age of piracy didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged partly from the unemployed privateer captains of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, who had been trained by their governments to do exactly what they refused to stop doing. The Dutch managed the transition better. Their privateer captains had two options that their English counterparts lacked. They could remain employed by the VOC or the GWC, either the Dutch East India or West India companies, which continued to need experienced maritime raiders and navigators for their own commercial operations. Or they could receive formal commissions with the Dutch state's navy, transitioning from private enterprise to official military service. Even with the infrastructure there to absorb them, some still went rogue. Klaas Kompan turned pirate before eventually negotiating his way back into Dutch legal standing. Jan Janzoen went further since he converted to Islam and joined the Barbary pirates operating off the North African coast. But the broader point is this: the privateering campaigns of England and the Netherlands against Spanish silver didn't destroy the Spanish Empire. Spain continued to extract silver from its American colonies for another 2 centuries. Still, what the privateers did was weaken Spain's naval dominance and divert enough silver that the Spanish campaigns ran short of funding. They would then channel enough wealth into English and Dutch coffers to help finance the commercial and imperial expansion. The British Empire and the Dutch Empire were built partly on money that started its life as Spanish silver before ending up somewhere different. The men who made that happen were operating in a space that barely exists anymore, somewhere between state military actor and independent entrepreneur. Authorized to use violence for profit under a temporary government license, they were heroes in their home countries and criminals in Spain's. Some of them became legends, some of them became pirates, and all of them, in ways they probably didn't fully understand while it was happening, were helping determine what the next 3 centuries of global power would look like. And we could imagine that's not an easy thing to do from the deck of a ship in the Atlantic.